Fleeing violence in his homeland, his family arrived as immigrants on the harsh Canadian prairies. They faced poverty and hardship, outsiders in a new world. The world saw nobody. Then, the law itself made his business illegal. Then, Prohibition became the law of the land. For Samuel Bronfman, it wasn't a ruinous obstacle. It was the greatest business opportunity in history. He handed them back a global liquor empire. His name was Samuel Bronfman. He built a fortress of wealth designed to protect his family for 1,000 years. His heirs tore it down in less than 10. And his granddaughter? She used what was left of the fortune to bankroll a depraved sex cult, landing herself in federal prison. So, how does a dynasty claw its way from the mud to the absolute pinnacle of the world, only to collapse into a spectacular inferno of corporate suicide and criminal infamy? Samuel Bronfman's story begins with desperation. In the Russian Empire, his Jewish family lived under the constant threat of violent massacres called pogroms. This terrifying existence forged a lifelong lesson in young Samuel. The world is dangerous, and true security only comes from wealth and power. Fleeing for their lives, the family emigrated to Canada, trading a familiar life for the harsh, frozen prairies of Saskatchewan. Early life was a brutal struggle of failed farming and odd jobs. They were outsiders, penniless and freezing. The family's fortunes changed when they moved to Manitoba and bought a small hotel. It was here, in the smoky hotel bar, that Samuel found his true calling. He wasn't just serving drinks, he was learning the art of the liquor trade, supply, demand, and most importantly, how to bend the law and exploit its loopholes. The push for prohibition wasn't just an American phenomenon. It was a powerful force in Canada as well. Fueled by a coalition of religious groups and social reformers who saw alcohol as the root of all evil, province after province began to enact its own form of prohibition. In 1916, Manitoba went dry. The Bronfman's primary source of income was suddenly illegal. For many, this would have been a catastrophic blow. For Samuel Bronfman, it was merely a new business challenge. When Manitoba went dry in 1916, Samuel Bronfman quickly pivoted into the mail-order liquor business, exploiting legal loopholes with remarkable speed. He had discovered a brilliant loophole in the law. While it was illegal to sell liquor within a dry province, a federal law stipulated that a distillery in a wet province like Quebec could legally ship its product to an individual in a dry province for personal use. It was a legal fiction, a glaring oversight that Samuel exploited with ruthless efficiency. He established a mail-order house in Montreal, took out advertisements in newspapers, and began shipping crates of whiskey across provincial borders. The orders flooded in. He became, in effect, a legal bootlegger, exploiting loopholes to ship liquor across provinces through freight and courier networks, always staying just inside the letter of the law. But this was just the warm-up act. The real show began in 1920 when the United States passed the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, ushering in national prohibition. Suddenly, a nation of over 100 million people was officially dry. The demand for illicit alcohol didn't just disappear, it exploded. A vast, thirsty, and incredibly lucrative black market materialized overnight. And just across a long, porous, and notoriously difficult to patrol border, Samuel Bronfman was waiting. Canada, after a brief and unpopular experiment with national prohibition, had largely returned control of liquor laws to the provinces. Crucially, provinces like Quebec allowed for the legal distillation, and most importantly, the legal export of alcoholic beverages. The American market was a vacuum, and Samuel Bronfman became a master at filling it. He transformed his business model. He was no longer just a mail-order man. He was an international exporter, the primary supplier to a legion of American bootleggers, gangsters, and syndicate bosses. His operation was a masterclass in plausible deniability. He would sell his product in enormous quantities to exporters at his warehouses in Canada. The cash changed hands on Canadian soil. The liquor was loaded onto boats or trucks. Once it crossed the invisible line of the international border, it was no longer his legal concern. He wasn't smuggling. He was merely supplying the smugglers. This legal distinction was the bedrock of his entire operation, a shield that allowed him to build a colossal fortune, while the likes of Al Capone were dodging bullets and federal agents. The logistics were staggering. On the East Coast, a flotilla of ships, known as Rum Row, would anchor just outside the 3-mile limit of U.S. territorial waters. Smaller, faster speedboats would then dart out under the cover of darkness to ferry the precious cargo of Canadian whiskey ashore. In the heartland, the Detroit River became a superhighway for smugglers. In the winter, fleets of souped-up cars, their engines roaring in the frigid air, would race across the frozen river, a perilous journey where the threat of crashing through the ice was as real as the threat of a customs patrol. Samuel Bronfman supplied them all. His whiskey, often raw and unaged at this point, was shipped in barrels, sometimes disguised as other goods. He became an expert in logistics, in managing a complex network of supply and demand that stretched from the distilleries of Quebec to the speakeasies of Chicago and New York. He dealt with dangerous men, individuals for whom violence was a routine part of doing business. Yet Samuel remained insulated, the respectable Canadian businessman, always one step removed from the crime and chaos his product fueled south of the border. The profits were almost beyond comprehension. He was making millions, tens of millions, in an era when a dollar had immense buying power. This influx of cash allowed him to think bigger, to move beyond simply being a supplier. He wanted to control the entire process from grain to glass. He wanted to build a brand, a legacy. He wanted respectability. In 1924, he took a major step towards this goal by founding his own company in Montreal, Distillers Corporation Limited. This was a declaration of intent. He was no longer just a savvy opportunist. He was an industrialist. But he knew that his name, already associated with the grimy world of bootlegging, lacked the prestige he craved. He needed a name with history, a name that suggested quality and tradition. He found it in Waterloo, Ontario, at a company founded in 1857 by Joseph E. Seagram. The Seagram Company was one of Canada's oldest and most respected distilleries. It had a reputation for quality, particularly for its fine rye whiskies. By the 1920s, however, the company was somewhat adrift. Joseph E. Seagram had passed away, and his heirs lacked his business acumen. Samuel Bronfman saw his chance. In 1928, he swooped in and acquired a controlling interest in the Seagram Company and merged it with his own. He kept the Seagram name, instantly cloaking his massive bootlegging-fueled operation in a veneer of old-world legitimacy. The new entity was called Distillers Corporation Seagrams Limited. It was a marriage of old money prestige and new money ruthlessness, and it was poised to become an unstoppable force. But Samuel Bronfman's true genius was not just in his exploitation of prohibition, nor in his shrewd corporate maneuvering. It was in his extraordinary foresight. While his competitors were focused on producing as much cheap, raw liquor as possible to meet the immediate, insatiable demand from the American black market, Samuel was playing a different game entirely. He understood a fundamental truth that seemed to escape everyone else. Prohibition would not last forever. He believed that when the law was eventually repealed, the American public, after years of drinking bathtub gin and rot gut spirits, would be desperate for high-quality, properly aged whiskey. So he began to do something that seemed insane to his contemporaries. He started to hold back vast quantities of his finest distillate, laying it down in charred oak barrels in massive bonded warehouses. He began to age it for 5, 7, even 10 years. This was a colossal financial gamble. He was tying up millions of dollars in inventory that would generate no immediate return. He was paying taxes and storage costs on a product he wasn't selling. His bookkeepers must have thought he was mad. His bootlegger clients who wanted their product now were surely perplexed. But Samuel, or Mr. Sam, as he insisted on being called by his employees, was resolute. He was a man with an almost tyrannical obsession with quality, a trait that seemed at odds with his bootlegging roots. He would personally oversee the blending process, a practice he would continue for the rest of his life. He wasn't a chemist, but he had a preternatural palate. He would line up dozens of samples, tasting, smelling, and carefully considering each one. He was searching for a specific profile, a whiskey that was smooth, light, and consistent. He believed that the future of the industry lay not in the harsh, fiery spirits of the past, but in refined, sophisticated blends that would appeal to a broader, more modern palate. He famously told his sons, "We must make a finer whiskey and a lighter whiskey, and a whiskey that is more pleasing to the palate." This wasn't just a business strategy. It was a personal crusade. He wanted to create a gentleman's drink, perhaps as a way to scrub the stain of his illicit past and elevate himself into the high society that often looked down on him as a nouveau rich upstart. As the 1920s roared on, his empire grew. He built and acquired more distilleries. His warehouses swelled with aging whiskey, a lake of liquid gold, patiently waiting. He was building an arsenal, preparing for a war he knew was coming, while the gangsters south of the border were making headlines with their Tommy guns and turf wars. Mr. Sam was quietly, methodically cornering the market on the future. He had built his fortune in the shadows of Prohibition, but he was positioning himself to become a king in the light that would follow. The stage was set, the barrels were full, and the end of America's noble experiment was drawing near. Samuel Bronfman, the immigrant boy from the prairies, was about to show the world what true power looked like. By the end of the Prohibition years, Samuel Bronfman, the shrewd immigrant who had turned a provincial hotel business into a liquor exporting machine, was sitting atop a veritable mountain of aging whiskey. Throughout the chaotic years of American Prohibition, while others chased the quick buck selling raw, fiery spirits to thirsty gangsters, Mr. Sam had played the long game. He had gambled millions, stockpiling vast reserves of his finest distillate in quiet, unassuming warehouses, waiting with the patience of a predator for the moment the law would inevitably change. By 1933, after 13 long, dry years, America was about to turn the taps back on, and Samuel Bronfman wasn't just ready to serve the first drink. He was ready to conquer the entire bar. The date was December 5th, 1933. All across the United States, a palpable sense of anticipation hung in the air. In town squares and city halls, crowds gathered, their eyes fixed on the clock. At precisely 5:32 p.m. Eastern Time, Utah became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, and with that final historic vote, the noble experiment of Prohibition was officially dead. A collective cheer erupted across the nation. Sirens wailed, horns blared, and long-dormant breweries dramatically switched on their lights. The great thirst was finally over. But this jubilant moment also triggered a frantic, chaotic scramble. The American distilling industry was in ruins. Once great distilleries had been shuttered for over a decade. Their equipment rusted, their master distillers retired or deceased. Those who scrambled to reopen faced a critical problem. You can't just create good whiskey overnight. It needs time, years spent maturing in oak barrels to develop its character and smoothness. The first legal American whiskeys to hit the market were, to put it mildly, rough. They were green, unaged, and often harsh, a far cry from the quality products of the pre-Prohibition era. The nation was free to drink, but the good stuff was in desperately short supply. This was the exact moment Samuel Bronfman had been planning for with meticulous, almost obsessive foresight for the better part of a decade. While American distillers were frantically firing up their new stills, Seagram's trucks, preloaded and waiting at the border, began to roll. It was an invasion, a perfectly executed commercial blitzkrieg. They didn't just bring whiskey, they brought aged whiskey. Smooth, palatable, beautifully blended spirits that immediately set a new standard for the post-Prohibition consumer. The American public, whose palates had been abused for 13 years by bathtub gin and questionable moonshine, tasted Seagram's products and were instantly converted. While competitors were selling raw, fiery spirits, Seagram offered sophistication in a bottle. Mr. Sam's colossal gamble had paid off on a scale that even he might not have fully anticipated. He didn't just enter the American market, he seized it. Seagram captured a monumental share of the spirits industry almost overnight, establishing a dominance that would go virtually unchallenged for half a century. The end of Prohibition wasn't just a victory for Seagram, it was a coronation. The foundation of this new kingdom was built on two pillars, two brands that would become American cultural icons, Seagram's Seven Crown and Seagram's VO. These weren't just whiskeys, they were the products of a revolutionary philosophy. Mr. Sam was an evangelist for blended whiskey. In the pre-Prohibition era, American drinkers were accustomed to straight whiskeys, bourbons and ryes from a single distillery. These spirits could be excellent, but they could also be inconsistent from barrel to barrel. Bronfman believed the future lay in blending, in taking multiple whiskeys of different ages and character profiles and combining them with neutral grain spirits to create a product that was flawlessly consistent, bottle after bottle, year after year. This was manufacturing, not just distilling. It was the application of industrial precision to an artisanal craft. Purists and competitors sneered, calling his products Canadian concoctions or factory whiskey. Samuel Bronfman simply did not care. He knew what the public wanted better than they did. He wanted to create a lighter, smoother, more approachable taste profile that would appeal not just to seasoned whiskey drinkers, but to everyone. Seagram's Seven Crown was the workhorse, the engine of the empire. It was a masterclass in marketing. The name itself was brilliant, suggesting royalty and quality. It was promoted not as a spirit to be sipped and contemplated by connoisseurs, but as the ultimate mixing whiskey. Seagram practically invented the concept of the highball, aggressively marketing the 7 and 7, 7 Crown, and 7 Up as the quintessential American cocktail. It was simple, refreshing, and accessible. From the 1940s through the 1970s, 7 Crown was, by a massive margin, the best-selling spirits brand in the United States. It was the drink of backyard barbecues, of bowling alleys, of nights out with friends. It was the taste of post-war American prosperity, and it made the Bronfman family astronomically wealthy. If 7 Crown was the people's drink, Seagram's VO was the brand that satisfied Mr. Sam's craving for prestige. The letter stood for very own, a name originating from a private blend Joseph E. Seagram had made for his family. Bronfman seized on this story, marketing VO as a premium, sophisticated Canadian whiskey, a step up from the everyday. The distinctive bottle, the elegant label, the higher price point. It was all designed to convey an aura of distinction. Advertisements for VO were placed in upscale magazines featuring distinguished-looking men in handsome settings, a world of success and good taste. The unspoken message was clear. This is what successful people drink. Owning a bottle of VO was an aspirational statement. Through these two brands and a growing portfolio of others, Seagram dominated the North American landscape. But the empire was not run by a board of directors or a committee. It was an absolute monarchy, and its undisputed and often terrifying king was Samuel Bronfman. Mr. Sam, as he was universally known, ruled his company with an iron fist and a volcanic temper. He was a micromanager of epic proportions, a man for whom no detail was too small, no decision too insignificant to escape his notice. His obsession with quality was legendary, and it manifested in a daily ritual that struck fear and awe into the hearts of his employees. Every single day, in a special tasting room, dozens of samples of whiskey from his distilleries around the world would be lined up for his inspection. With the solemnity of a high priest, Mr. Sam would move down the line, sniffing, sipping, and swishing each sample. His palate was so refined, he could allegedly detect the slightest imperfection, a deviation of a single percentage point in the blend. If a sample did not meet his impossibly high standards, his fury was swift and terrible. Executives would be summoned and subjected to blistering tirades. Master blenders, men at the pinnacle of their profession, would tremble before him. He was a tyrant, but his tyranny was always in service of the product. His personal motto, which was plastered on the walls of Seagram's offices, was "Only the finest is fine enough." And he meant it. Life as a Seagram executive was a nerve-wracking existence. They were paid lavishly, but they lived in constant fear of their boss's displeasure. Stories of his temper became legendary. It was said he would throw phones, smash glasses, and unleash torrents of verbal abuse that could wither the most seasoned businessman. Yet, for all his ferocity, he inspired a fanatical loyalty. He drove his people relentlessly, but he also drove himself harder than anyone. He was a paradox, a crude, often vulgar man who was obsessed with creating a product of supreme elegance, a bootlegger who desperately craved the legitimacy and respect of high society. This craving for respectability would find its ultimate expression not in a bottle, but in a building. By the 1950s, Seagram was at the zenith of its power, a global corporation with its North American headquarters in the aging Chrysler Building in New York City. For Mr. Sam, this wasn't good enough. He wanted a monument, a physical embodiment of the Bronfman dynasty's power and prestige. He decided to build a new headquarters on what was then the most expensive real estate in the world, Park Avenue. He initially envisioned a traditional, ostentatious tower, a monument to his own ego. But here, the story takes an interesting turn thanks to his daughter, Phyllis Lambert. Phyllis, then a young woman studying architecture, was appalled by her father's conventional choice of architect. In a now famous 8-page letter, she passionately implored him to reconsider. "This is not just a building," she argued. "It is a statement. It must be a contribution to the city, a work of art." Astonishingly, the dictatorial Mr. Sam listened. He gave his 27-year-old daughter the responsibility and the budget to find the greatest architect in the world. Her choice was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, a titan of the modernist movement, famous for his minimalist less is more philosophy. Working with Philip Johnson, Mies designed a skyscraper unlike any New York had ever seen. Completed in 1958, the Seagram building was a breathtaking tower of bronze and topaz-tinted glass. It didn't shout its presence. It radiated a quiet, confident authority. In a city where developers maximized every square inch, Mies set the tower back from the street, creating a grand public plaza, an act of corporate generosity that revolutionized urban design. The building was an instant masterpiece, hailed by critics as the most beautiful skyscraper in the world. It was Samuel Bronfman's Parthenon, a permanent, unimpeachable symbol of his arrival. The bootlegger from the prairies now owned a piece of the New York skyline that was considered high art. With North America conquered and his legacy cemented in bronze, Mr. Sam turned his gaze outward. The post-war era was a time of global expansion, and Seagram began to acquire and build brands around the world. In 1949, in a move of particular genius, the company purchased Chivas Brothers, a small but highly respected Scottish distiller that produced a premium blended Scotch whiskey called Chivas Regal. Under Seagram's marketing muscle, Chivas Regal was transformed from a niche product into the world's first global luxury spirit, a symbol of international sophistication. The acquisitions continued. They bought rum distilleries in Jamaica and Puerto Rico. Their expansion included the pivotal 1944 acquisition of Long Pond Distillery in Jamaica, the deal that brought a brand named Captain Morgan rum into their portfolio. They expanded into wine, buying up vineyards in France and California. The sun, it was said, never set on the Seagram empire. From Montreal to London, from Kingston to Paris, the Bronfman machine was churning out profits on a scale that was difficult to fathom. Samuel Bronfman was not just the king of booze. He was the emperor. But as the emperor aged, the question of succession began to loom large. A dynasty is only as strong as its next generation. And Mr. Sam had two sons who were destined to inherit his vast kingdom, Edgar and Charles. Their upbringing was a world away from their father's hardscrabble youth in Saskatchewan. They grew up in opulent mansions, attended the finest schools, and never knew a day of financial insecurity. But they also grew up under the immense, suffocating shadow of their domineering father. Edgar, the elder son, was groomed from an early age to take over. He was charming, intelligent, and shared some of his father's ambition, but he was also more polished, more at ease in the high society circles his father had struggled to enter. He was sent to New York to learn the American side of the business, the most crucial part of the empire. Charles, the younger son, was quieter, more introspective. He remained in Montreal, managing the Canadian operations and developing a deep passion for philanthropy, a trait he shared with his mother, Sadie. Sadie Bronfman was the quiet matriarch of the family, a formidable force in her own right who channeled the family's immense wealth into countless charitable causes, particularly within the Jewish community, becoming a revered figure in Canada. Mr. Sam's relationship with his sons was complex and often fraught with tension. He desperately wanted them to succeed, to carry on his legacy, but he could never fully bring himself to trust their judgment. He doubted they possessed his tiger's blood, the killer instinct and relentless drive that had been forged in the crucible of poverty and anti-Semitism. He would berate them, test them, and publicly question their decisions, all while privately hoping they would prove him wrong. He was preparing them to inherit a flawless, perfectly running machine, but he feared they lacked the mechanic's soul to truly understand how it worked. By the late 1960s, Samuel Bronfman was an old man. He was still the undisputed patriarch. his presence still commanding fear and respect in the corridors of the Seagram building. He had achieved more than the young boy from Bessarabia could have ever dreamed. He had built a fortress of wealth that was seemingly impregnable. He had created a global empire that was the envy of the world. He had outsmarted the law, outmaneuvered his rivals, and built a legacy that seemed destined to last for centuries. The Seagram Company was at its absolute zenith, a golden age of unparalleled profit and influence. As the decade drew to a close, the aging lion could look upon his creation and see nothing but strength and stability stretching to the horizon. But empires, like the men who build them, are mortal, and the seeds of change, of diversification, and of a future that would have been unimaginable to Mr. Sam were already being quietly sown. The transition of power was coming, and with it, the first tremors of the earthquake that would one day bring the entire magnificent structure crashing down. We last saw the Bronfman dynasty at the absolute peak of its power. Under the iron-fisted rule of its patriarch, Samuel Bronfman, Seagram had grown from a shadowy Prohibition-era operation into the world's largest, most prestigious spirits company. Mr. Sam, the immigrant boy from the shtetl, had built a global empire, a fortress of wealth, and had cemented his legacy with a timeless monument of bronze and glass on Park Avenue. His sons, Edgar and Charles, were poised to inherit this flawless, glittering machine. The golden age was in full swing, and the Bronfman name seemed destined for eternal greatness. But even the most formidable monarchies must face the inevitable moment of succession. And as the old king's reign drew to a close, a new generation with new ideas was waiting in the wings, ready to steer the imperial ship into uncharted and ultimately treacherous waters. In the summer of 1971, in his grand mansion in Montreal, Samuel Bronfman died at the age of 82. The news of his passing marked the end of an era, not just for his family, but for the entire industry he had helped to create. The obituaries celebrated him as a titan of Canadian business, a visionary industrialist, a philanthropist. They conveniently glossed over the rough-and-tumble origins of his fortune, the murky deals made in the shadows of Prohibition. In death, Mr. Sam had finally achieved the one thing that had eluded him for so long in life: universal, unqualified respectability. The funeral was a state affair, attended by prime ministers and captains of industry. But beneath the somber eulogies, a single unspoken question hung in the air. What now? For 50 years, Seagram had been an extension of one man's will. Samuel Bronfman hadn't just run the company. He was the company. His personality, his obsessions, his genius, and his volcanic temper were infused into its very DNA. Now, the throne was empty. The crown passed, as was always the plan, to his eldest son, Edgar M. Bronfman. From this point on, to avoid confusion with his own son, we'll refer to him as Edgar Sr. At 42 years old, Edgar Sr. was, in many ways, the polar opposite of his father. Where Mr. Sam was gruff, volatile, and carried the scars of his impoverished upbringing, Edgar Sr. was polished, urbane, and exuded the quiet confidence of a man born to immense privilege. He was a product of the finest schools, a patron of the arts, and moved with ease through the corridors of power in Washington and New York. He was a diplomat, where his father had been a warrior. The pressure on him was immense. He was inheriting a masterpiece, a perfectly calibrated machine that generated astonishing profits year after year. His primary directive, both from the board and from the ghost of his father, was simple: don't break it. And for a time, he adhered to that directive with admirable skill. During the 1970s, Edgar Sr. proved to be a steady and capable custodian of the empire. He understood the liquor business intimately, having been groomed for the role his entire life. The cash cows, Seven Crown, VO, Chivas Regal, continued their market dominance. The company's profits remained robust, its position at the top of the industry secure. Seagram, it seemed, could survive the loss of its founder. But Edgar Sr. was not his father. He lacked Mr. Sam's all-consuming obsession with the day-to-day grind of the spirits business. He found the endless cycles of blending, bottling, and marketing to be, if not tedious, then at least unfulfilling. His passions lay elsewhere, in politics and philanthropy, and particularly in advocating for Jewish causes around the world, a mission that would later lead him to become the influential president of the World Jewish Congress. He was a statesman trapped in a distiller's body, and he began to look for a way to make his own mark, to step out from under his father's colossal shadow. He wanted to do something big, something bold, something his father would never have even considered. His opportunity arrived in the wake of the 1970s oil crisis. The energy shock had sent ripples through the global economy, and corporate wisdom of the era dictated diversification. The idea that a company should stick to what it knows best fell out of fashion. Instead, the conglomerate was king. Edgar Sr. decided that Seagram's future and his own legacy lay in diversifying away from its reliance on liquor. In 1980, Seagram sold off its oil and gas subsidiary, Texas Pacific Oil Company, for a massive $2.3 billion. Now Edgar Sr. was sitting on a mountain of cash, and he was ready to go hunting for a very different kind of beast. His target was Conoco Incorporated, a massive American oil and gas company. In 1981, Seagram launched an audacious hostile takeover bid. The move shocked Wall Street. What did a Canadian whiskey company know about running a big oil firm? The old guard within Seagram was horrified. This was a radical departure from Mr. Sam's philosophy. But Edgar Sr. was determined. The bid for Conoco ignited a fierce corporate war, and Seagram ultimately lost out to a rival bidder, the chemical giant A. DuPont de Nemours and Company, better known as DuPont. Losing the battle for Conoco seemed like a major defeat, but it led to one of the most brilliant and lucrative consolation prizes in corporate history. As part of the complex deal-making, Seagram ended up trading its Conoco shares for a 20% stake in the much larger and more stable DuPont. Suddenly, the Bronfman family was the largest single shareholder in one of America's oldest and most iconic industrial corporations. This DuPont investment was Edgar Sr.'s masterpiece. It was a stroke of genius. Over the next decade and a half, the investment proved to be a spectacular success. DuPont was a steady blue-chip performer, and its stock value soared. More importantly, it threw off hundreds of millions of dollars a year in reliable dividends, cash that flowed directly into Seagram's coffers. This single investment became the new engine of Seagram's profitability, a golden goose that insulated the company from the whims of the liquor market. Edgar Sr. had done it. He had successfully diversified the company and secured its financial future for a generation. He had proven that he was more than just his father's son. He was a formidable businessman in his own right. The empire seemed safer and stronger than ever. But as Edgar Sr. was solidifying his own legacy, a new Bronfman was beginning to make his presence felt. Edgar Bronfman Jr., son of Edgar Sr., was cut from a different cloth entirely. Handsome, charismatic, and imbued with a romantic spirit, Edgar Jr. had little interest in the traditional family business of distilling or the sober world of chemical manufacturing. His heart was in Hollywood. As a young man, he rebelled against the path laid out for him, dropping out of Williams College to pursue a creative life. He moved to New York and became a songwriter and a Broadway producer. He even had some modest success, co-writing lyrics for songs recorded by artists like Dionne Warwick and Celine Dion. He then dipped his toes into the film industry, producing movies like the 1980 box office disappointment, The Border, starring Jack Nicholson. To his family, particularly his grandfather, these pursuits were frivolous, a dalliance unworthy of a Bronfman heir. But for Edgar Jr., the world of entertainment was intoxicating. It was a world of creativity, glamour, and cultural influence that the liquor business, for all its profitability, could never offer. Edgar Sr. watched his son's Hollywood adventures with a mixture of pride and concern. He desperately wanted Edgar Jr. to join the family business, to learn the ropes and prepare to one day take his place at the helm. After years of gentle persuasion, and perhaps recognizing that his own creative career was not destined for superstardom, Edgar Jr. finally relented. In 1982, he joined Seagram, starting as an assistant to the chairman. He was a quick study, and his natural charisma served him well in the corporate world. He rose quickly through the ranks, first in London, then as head of the U.S. company. But he never lost his fascination with Hollywood. He saw the entertainment industry not as a flight of fancy, but as the future. He believed that the convergence of content and distribution was the next great frontier of business. He looked at Seagram's vast resources and saw not just a liquor company, but a potential media titan. This vision was radically different from his father's more conservative approach. Where Edgar Sr. saw DuPont as a source of stable, passive income, Edgar Jr. saw it as a war chest, a vast pile of capital that could be used to acquire a Hollywood studio and transform Seagram overnight. The dynamic between father and son during this period was complex. Edgar Sr., who had spent years trying to get his son into the business, now found himself confronted with an ambition that was both impressive and alarming. By the early 1990s, Edgar Jr. was the clear heir apparent, and he was relentlessly pushing his vision for a media-centric Seagram. In 1993, he convinced his father and the board to make a preliminary move, acquiring a 15% stake in Time Warner. This was Edgar Jr. firing a warning shot, signaling his intentions. Then, in 1994, the torch was officially passed. At the age of 65, Edgar Sr. stepped down as chief executive officer, handing the reins of the empire to his 39-year-old son. Edgar Jr. was now in command, and he wasted no time in executing his grand and incredibly risky strategy. His first order of business was to get rid of the family's crown jewel, the DuPont stake. The decision was met with shock and fierce opposition, both within the company and from Wall Street. The DuPont investment was the bedrock of Seagram's financial health. It was safe, it was profitable, and it provided a massive, steady stream of cash. To sell it seemed like an act of corporate insanity. Why would you sell your most reliable asset to fund a risky foray into one of the most volatile businesses in the world? The boardroom battles were reportedly intense. Warren Buffett, a friend and mentor to Edgar Sr., famously advised against the move, arguing that the entertainment business was a fool's game where it was nearly impossible to build lasting value. Even Edgar Sr. was said to have had deep reservations. But Edgar Jr. was persuasive, charismatic, and utterly convinced that he was right. He argued that DuPont was a relic of the past, a slow-growing industrial giant, while entertainment was the future, a world of explosive growth. He managed to win over the board. His father, in a move he would later come to deeply regret, ultimately deferred to his son's vision. In the spring of 1995, Seagram sold its 24% stake in DuPont, back to the company in a deal worth roughly $9 billion. On paper, it was a triumph, representing a multi-billion-dollar profit on Edgar Sr.'s original investment. The business press buzzed with excitement. Edgar Jr. was hailed as a bold new visionary, but a few seasoned observers felt a deep sense of unease. He hadn't just sold an asset, he had sold the company's soul, its anchor in a turbulent world. Edgar Jr. didn't even wait for the cash to clear. He immediately pivoted to his real target, MCA Incorporated. MCA was a legendary Hollywood institution, a sprawling conglomerate that owned Universal Pictures, the Universal Music Group, the largest record company in the world, and a collection of theme parks. It was a content creation powerhouse, and Edgar Jr. wanted it desperately. Within weeks of the DuPont sale, he struck a deal to buy an 80% controlling stake in MCA from Matsushita in a transaction valued at about $5.7 to $5.8 billion. Overnight, the Seagram company, the house that whiskey built, was transformed. Its primary business was no longer liquor. It was movies, music, and theme parks. Edgar Jr. was ecstatic. He had done it. He had single-handedly remade his family's 70-year-old company in his own image. He moved to Hollywood, hobnobbing with stars and studio heads, living the life he had always dreamed of. He renamed MCA to Universal Studios Incorporated, and he was its new king. The move was hailed in Hollywood as a breath of fresh air. Here was a young, creative-friendly owner who seemed to understand and respect the industry. But outside the bubble of Hollywood, the warning signs were already there. Seagram had traded the predictable, steady profits of liquor and chemicals for the brutal hit-or-miss economics of the movie business. For every blockbuster like Jurassic Park, there were a dozen costly flops. They had entered a world where success was fleeting and failure was catastrophically expensive. Edgar Jr. had bet the entire Bronfman family fortune, a fortune meticulously built and protected over 3 generations, on a single, dazzling roll of the dice in Hollywood. The old, reliable Seagram, the company of Mr. Sam, and his perfectly blended whiskeys, was gone. In its place stood a new, glamorous, and terrifyingly vulnerable entertainment giant. It was an exhilarating moment filled with the promise of a bold, new future. But in selling off the stability of the past for the glamour of the present, Edgar Jr. had set the stage for the final disastrous act of the Bronfman dynasty. The empire's foundations had been deliberately dismantled, and the storm clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. At the end of our last chapter, the Bronfman family empire stood on the precipice of a seismic transformation. The old world of whiskey and stable industrial investments, so carefully curated by Samuel Bronfman and his son Edgar Sr., had been cast aside. In its place, Edgar Bronfman Jr., the charismatic heir with stardust in his eyes, had staked the entire family fortune on a glamorous and notoriously fickle dream, Hollywood. By selling the family's rock-solid stake in DuPont and acquiring the legendary MCA/Universal, he had single-handedly remade the company in his own image. The venerable House of Seagram was now a full-fledged entertainment giant. The move was audacious, visionary, and celebrated by many as the dawn of a new era. But in trading the safety of the past for the dazzling uncertainty of the future, Edgar Jr. had set in motion a chain of events that would lead not to a new golden age, but to the complete and utter destruction of the dynasty his grandfather had built. The mid to late 1990s were a heady time for Edgar Bronfman Jr. He had swapped the oak-paneled boardrooms of New York for the sun-drenched studio lots of Los Angeles. He was no longer just the scion of a liquor fortune. He was a Hollywood mogul, a peer of men like Michael Eisner and Sumner Redstone. He was popular, known for being approachable and artist-friendly, a stark contrast to the notoriously tight-fisted Japanese executives from Matsushita, who had previously owned Universal. He greenlit projects, he courted movie stars, and he passionately believed he could steer the studio to new heights. And for a while, it seemed like his gamble might just pay off. Universal Pictures, under his tenure, released a string of commercial hits. Films like Apollo 13, The Nutty Professor with Eddie Murphy, and Jim Carrey's Liar Liar raked in hundreds of millions at the box office. The music division, Universal Music Group, was an absolute juggernaut, the largest and most profitable record company in the world, with a roster of superstars that dominated the charts. On the surface, things looked good, but the reality of running a Hollywood studio was far more brutal than Edgar Jr. may have anticipated. The liquor business, the foundation of his family's wealth, was a business of remarkable consistency. People bought Chivas Regal and Seven Crown in good times and in bad. The profit margins were steady. The market was predictable. Hollywood was the exact opposite. It was a business of dizzying highs and catastrophic lows. For every twister that became a blockbuster, there was a costly and embarrassing flop like Waterworld, the infamous Kevin Costner epic, whose budget spiraled out of control, or the critically panned sequel, Babe, Pig in the City. Edgar Jr. quickly discovered that he was on a relentless, high-stakes roller coaster. The steady, reliable dividends from the old DuPont investment were gone, replaced by the wild, unpredictable swings of box office returns. The culture clash was also immense. The sober, buttoned-down corporate culture of Seagram in New York was a world away from the freewheeling, ego-driven chaos of Hollywood. There was a constant tension between the creative executives who wanted to spend lavishly on big-name stars and risky projects, and the Seagram bean counters who were terrified by the spiraling costs. Edgar Jr., a man who desperately wanted to be seen as a creative visionary, often found himself caught in the middle. More fundamentally, Edgar Jr. became consumed by the dominant business ideology of the late 1990s dot-com era, the siren song of synergy and convergence. The theory, preached by tech gurus and Wall Street analysts, was that the future belonged to vertically integrated media giants. A single company, it was argued, needed to own both the content, the movies, music, and TV shows, and the pipes, the cable systems, internet providers, and television networks that delivered that content to consumers. Edgar Jr. looked at his own company and saw a glaring weakness. With Universal, he had a treasure trove of content, but he didn't own the pipes. He had no cable network, no major broadcast channel, no internet portal. He felt like a king with a magnificent castle, but no roads leading to it. This feeling of incompleteness, of being a half player in a game of giants, grew into an obsession. He began to believe that Universal, on its own, was not big enough to survive. He needed to merge with a company that owned the pipes. He needed a transformative deal, a deal that would catapult him into the highest echelon of global media moguls. He began to search for a partner, and in his search he found a man in Paris who was just as ambitious, just as charismatic, and ultimately just as reckless as he was. His name was Jean-Marie Messier. Messier was the CEO of a century-old French company called Vivendi. For most of its history, Vivendi had been a rather boring, if profitable, water utility and construction firm known as General des Eaux, but under Messier's hyper-aggressive leadership, it was undergoing a radical transformation. Messier was a product of the French establishment, a brilliant financier with a dazzling intellect and an ego to match. His critics called him J6M, for Jean-Marie Messier, moi-même, maître du monde, which translates to Jean-Marie Messier, me, myself, master of the world. Like Edgar Jr., Messier was a true believer in the gospel of convergence, and he was using Vivendi's stable utility revenues, along with mountains of debt, to go on an astonishing global shopping spree. He was buying up telecom companies, TV stations, and tech firms, remaking the old water company into a modern media and communications empire. When Messier looked at his own growing empire, he saw the opposite problem to Edgar Jr.'s. He was acquiring the pipes, but he lacked world-class content, particularly American content that could travel globally. When he looked at Seagram and its universal assets, he saw the missing piece of his puzzle. The two men met in the late 1990s. They were in many ways kindred spirits. Both were visionaries who felt constrained by their company's old-world legacies. Both were charming, persuasive, and utterly convinced of their own brilliance. They began a corporate courtship, a series of secret meetings in Paris and New York. Messier sold Edgar Jr. on a grand vision, a new transatlantic media superpower, a company that would rival AOL Time Warner and Viacom, a French-American giant that would dominate the 21st century media landscape. Edgar Jr. was completely seduced. This was the deal he had been dreaming of, the move that would validate his entire strategy. In the spring of 2000, the negotiations intensified. The deal they hammered out was breathtaking in its scale, a $34 billion all-stock merger that would see Seagram completely absorbed by Vivendi. The new company would be called Vivendi Universal, and Jean-Marie Messier would be its chairman and CEO. Edgar Jr. would be given a senior executive role, a vice chairmanship. He would be a top dog in a much bigger kennel. But hidden in the complex terms of the deal was a clause that would prove to be the Bronfman dynasty's death warrant. They were not receiving cash for their company. They were receiving shares in the new combined entity. And because Vivendi was already so much larger than Seagram, the Bronfman family's controlling stake in their own company would be transformed into a small minority position in Vivendi Universal. Their final stake would be around 8%. For the first time in the company's history, the Bronfman family would no longer be in control. They were handing the keys to the empire, the entire legacy built by Mr. Sam, over to Jean-Marie Messier. The decision caused a profound and agonizing rift within the Bronfman family. Edgar Sr., the man who had so brilliantly safeguarded and grown the family fortune with the DuPont investment, was reportedly horrified. He saw Messier for what he was, a reckless gambler playing with other people's money. He pleaded with his son to reconsider. According to some reports, their final conversation on the matter was heartbreaking. Edgar Sr. warned his son, "You're not just betting the company, you're betting my grandchildren's money." Charles Bronfman, Edgar Jr.'s uncle, who ran the Canadian side of the business, was also vehemently opposed, seeing the deal as a complete betrayal of his father's legacy. But Edgar Jr. was immovable. He was convinced this was the path to the future. He believed in Messier's vision, and perhaps more importantly, he believed in his own. He had come too far to turn back now. He used his position as head of the family trust to push the deal through, overriding the objections of his father and uncle. In June of 2000, the deal was announced to the world. Edgar Jr. stood beside Messier at a triumphant press conference, beaming. He had done it. He was now a senior executive at the second largest media company on the planet. He had traded his family's kingdom for a seat at the emperor's table. He just didn't realize the emperor was mad, and the palace was about to burn to the ground. The collapse came with a speed and ferocity that no one, least of all Edgar Jr., could have predicted. The ink was barely dry on the merger when the dot-com bubble burst. The irrational exuberance of the late 90s evaporated, and the stock market, particularly for media and tech companies, went into a nosedive. The central premise of the Vivendi-Universal merger, that synergy between old and new media would create explosive growth, was revealed to be a fantasy. Jean-Marie Messier's empire, which had been built on a mountain of debt, began to crumble. The profits he had promised failed to materialize. His lavish spending, a $17.5 million apartment in New York, corporate jets, extravagant parties, and his arrogant, dismissive attitude towards investors created a crisis of confidence. And the stock price of Vivendi Universal, the very stock that now represented the entirety of the Bronfman family's wealth, began to plummet. For the Bronfmans, it was a waking nightmare. They were trapped. As minority shareholders, they were powerless, forced to watch from the sidelines as Messier drove their inheritance off a cliff. The value of their holdings melted away like ice in the desert sun. The stock fell from over $70 a share at the time of the merger to under $10 a share within 2 years. Billions of dollars of Bronfman wealth were vaporized. The fortune that had taken nearly a century of relentless toil, brilliant strategy, and careful stewardship to build was wiped out in a matter of months. By the summer of 2002, Vivendi was on the verge of bankruptcy, crushed by an estimated $35 billion in debt. The board finally revolted and, in a dramatic showdown, ousted Jean-Marie Messier. But it was too late. The damage was done. A new management team was brought in with a single, desperate mandate: sell off assets to pay down the debt and save the company from complete collapse. And what was the most valuable, most easily liquidated asset on their books? It was the old, reliable, cash-generating spirits and wine division, the very heart of the original Seagram company. In a moment of profound and tragic irony, the business that Edgar Jr. had effectively traded away to pursue his Hollywood dream was now being sold to pay for the catastrophic failure of that dream. In December of 2001, the Seagram spirits and wine business, the legacy of Mr. Sam, was officially put on the auction block. The vultures circled. The company was broken up and sold, piece by painful piece, to its fiercest global competitors. Diageo, the British beverage giant, bought the largest share, acquiring iconic brands like Captain Morgan Rum and Crown Royal Canadian Whiskey. Pernod Ricard, a French company, snapped up Chivas Regal Scotch, among others. The sale fetched a total of $8.15 billion. It was a fire sale, the final ignominious end to a century-long legacy. The Bronfman name, once the most powerful in the world of liquor, was now officially out of the business. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. In less than a decade, Edgar Jr.'s ambition had led to the complete obliteration of his family's empire. He had started with a company that owned a vast, profitable liquor business and a 25% stake in DuPont, with a combined value in the tens of billions. He had ended with a minority stake in a bankrupt media conglomerate, a stake that was worth a fraction of its original value. He had lost the company, he had lost control, and he had lost the vast majority of his family's fortune. It remains one of the most stunning and catastrophic destructions of shareholder value in modern corporate history. The dream of a Hollywood mogul had dissolved into a corporate nightmare. The Bronfman name was no longer a symbol of success, but a cautionary tale of hubris, ambition, and breathtakingly poor judgment. The empire was gone. The legacy was in tatters. And as the family reeled from this devastating financial blow, a far more sinister and disturbing scandal was quietly taking root in the lives of Edgar Sr.'s daughters. A scandal that had nothing to do with balance sheets or stock prices, but with the dark, manipulative world of a destructive personality cult. The fall of the House of Bronfman was not yet complete. When we last looked upon the House of Bronfman, it was a smoldering ruin. The great corporate empire, built over a century of grit, genius, and ambition, had been dismantled and sold for scrap. The victim of a single catastrophic gamble on the glitz of Hollywood. The family fortune was decimated, their legacy of business acumen replaced by a cautionary tale of hubris. For any other dynasty, this would have been the final tragic chapter. But for the Bronfmans, the financial collapse was merely a prelude to a far darker, more insidious story. As the dust settled on the corporate wreckage, a scandal of a completely different magnitude was festering in the quiet, privileged lives of the family's next generation. This new chapter has nothing to do with stock prices or boardrooms. It is a story of psychological manipulation, moral decay, and the descent into the chilling heart of a destructive cult. To understand this next horrifying chapter, we must turn our attention away from the men who built and lost the empire, Samuel, Edgar Sr., and Edgar Jr., and focus on two of its daughters, Sarah and Claire Bronfman. They were the children of Edgar Sr.'s second marriage, heiresses to a fortune that, even in its diminished state, was still vast, beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. They grew up in a world of unimaginable privilege, sprawling estates in Virginia, private jets, and a life insulated from the mundane struggles of the world. But this gilded existence came with its own unique set of pressures. They lived in the long shadows of their powerful father and their older, high-profile half-brother, Edgar Jr. While the men of the family were making headlines and running a global empire, Sarah and Claire were searching for their own purpose, their own identity in a world where their primary definition was simply heiress. Sarah was the more outgoing of the two, a socialite who dabbled in philanthropy. Claire was quieter, more intense and driven. She found her passion not in the boardroom or the ballroom, but in the highly disciplined and incredibly expensive world of competitive show jumping. For years, she poured her energy and a significant amount of her money into her equestrian career. She was talented and dedicated, reaching a high level in the sport, but she never quite achieved the Olympic-level greatness she craved. By her late 20s, her competitive career was winding down, leaving a void. Like so many others with immense wealth but a lack of clear direction, the Bronfman sisters were seekers, searching for something more, for a sense of meaning that their money couldn't buy. And it was this searching, this vulnerability, that made them the perfect targets for a new kind of predator. His name was Keith Raniere, and to the outside world he was not a charismatic robe-wearing guru. He was a small, nerdy-looking man with a volleyball obsession, a soft, hypnotic voice, and a mind of terrifying, manipulative genius. He presented himself not as a spiritual leader, but as a scientific visionary, a polymath with a supposed IQ of 240, one of the highest in recorded history. He claimed to have developed a revolutionary new technology for unlocking human potential. He called it rational inquiry, and it was the basis for a series of hugely expensive self-help workshops he called Executive Success Programs, or ESP. But behind this veneer of scientific respectability was a dark and sordid history. In the 1990s, Raniere had run a company called Consumers Byline, which was investigated by multiple states and shut down for being an illegal pyramid scheme. He was a master of psychological manipulation, a predator who was preternaturally skilled at identifying people's deepest insecurities and exploiting them for his own gain. After his pyramid scheme collapsed, he reemerged with his co-founder, a therapist named Nancy Salzman, and created NXIVM, pronounced NXIVM, the parent company for ESP. ESP. They set up their headquarters in a drab suburban landscape outside Albany, New York, and began to recruit. Their primary targets were intelligent, successful, and often very wealthy individuals who were nonetheless searching for something more. People exactly like Sarah and Claire Bronfman. In 2002, Sarah was the first to be drawn in. A family friend recommended an ESP workshop as a way to help her work through some personal issues. She was immediately captivated. Ranier's teachings, a complex and often nonsensical jargon of modules, integrations, and disintegrations, seemed profound. The intense multi-day workshops, which could cost upwards of $10,000, created a powerful sense of community and emotional breakthrough. Participants were encouraged to reveal their most intimate secrets and traumas, a technique that created intense emotional bonds while also providing Raniere and his inner circle with a trove of potential blackmail material. Sarah believed she had found the answer to all of her problems. She was so enthralled that she immediately insisted her younger sister Claire join as well. Claire was initially skeptical, but she eventually relented. For Claire, the experience was nothing short of a conversion. She saw in Keith Raniere not just a teacher, but a messiah, the most ethical and intelligent man she had ever met. She believed his teachings were the key to saving humanity, and she dedicated herself to his cause with the same ferocious intensity she had once reserved for her equestrian career. The Bronfman sisters had found their purpose, and Keith Raniere had found his golden geese. It began with donations and course fees, but it quickly escalated. Raniere was a master at convincing his wealthy followers that the only ethical use of their unearned, inherited wealth was to invest it in his humanitarian projects. He identified Claire, the more zealous and dedicated of the two sisters, as the key to unlocking the family fortune, and she opened the vaults to him without hesitation. Over the next decade and a half, reports estimate that Claire and Sarah Bronfman poured more than $100 million into NXIVM and its related ventures. This wasn't just philanthropy. It was the complete financial takeover of two of the wealthiest women in the world. The money funded Raniere's bizarre and often disastrous schemes. Claire reportedly lost over $65 million of her own money investing in the commodities market, based on a system Raniere claimed to have developed that could predict market fluctuations. The money was used to buy a private jet to ferry Raniere and his inner circle around the world. It funded a sprawling real estate empire in the Albany area, where dedicated NXIVM followers lived and worked, often for little or no pay. The Bronfman sisters' inheritance was being used to build Keith Raniere a kingdom. But Claire's role soon evolved beyond that of a mere financial backer. She became one of the highest-ranking and most powerful figures within the NXIVM organization, a member of its executive board. She was no longer just a follower. She was an enabler, an enforcer, and her primary duty was to use the family's immense wealth and legal firepower to wage a relentless war on Keith Raniere's enemies. This became Claire Bronfman's new purpose. She weaponized her fortune. NXIVM became notoriously litigious, and Claire was the one who paid the legal bills. Anyone who dared to speak out against the group, former members, journalists, critics, found themselves buried in a blizzard of frivolous, ruinously expensive lawsuits. They hired aggressive law firms and private investigators to dig up dirt on their perceived enemies, to harass them, to intimidate them into silence. They were accused of infiltrating computer systems and manipulating financial records. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to destroy the lives of anyone who threatened to expose the truth about Keith Raniere. Claire Bronfman was the general of this legal army, and she pursued her targets with a chilling, remorseless zeal. The Bronfman name, once a symbol of corporate power, was now being used as a cudgel to protect a manipulative cult leader. While Claire was waging war on the outside world, an even more sinister reality was unfolding within NXIVM's secret inner sanctum. For years, rumors had swirled about Raniere's sexual relationships with his female followers, but the truth was far more horrifying than anyone imagined. Within NXIVM, Raniere had established a secret master-slave sorority known as DOS, an acronym for a Latin phrase, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which roughly translates to Master over Obedient Female Companions. This was the dark, rotten core of the entire organization. Female members were recruited into what they were told was a secret women's empowerment group. To join, they were required to provide collateral, highly damaging material like nude photos, false confessions to crimes, or signed documents giving away their assets. This collateral was held by their master to ensure their absolute secrecy and obedience. The women were organized into a pyramid structures of slaves and masters, with every chain of command leading ultimately to the Grand Master at the top, Keith Raniere. The abuse within DOS was systematic and sadistic. The slaves were forced to adhere to dangerously restrictive diets, with some women consuming as few as 500 calories a day because Raniere preferred his women to be rail thin. They were required to be available for their master's beck and call 24/7, and many were coerced into sexual acts with Raniere. And then there was the branding. In a horrifying ritual, women were held down naked by their peers, while another member used a cauterizing pen to sear a symbol into their flesh, near their pubic region. They were told it was a symbol of the elements. It was only later, after one of the brands was photographed, that the truth was revealed. The symbol was not an abstract design. It was a stylized monogram containing the initials of Keith Raniere. While it has never been proven that Claire Bronfman was a member of DOS or was even aware of its most extreme practices, it is indisputable that her money and her legal terrorism were essential for creating the shield of secrecy and fear that allowed this horrific abuse to flourish for years. She was the protector of the kingdom where these atrocities took place. The NXIVM empire, which had seemed so impenetrable for so long, finally began to crumble in 2017. A courageous former member named Sarah Edmondson, who had been branded, decided to go public with her story. Her account, published in a bombshell expose in the New York Times, ripped the respectable self-help facade off NXIVM and exposed the evil at its core. The story went viral, and the FBI, which had been circling the organization for years, finally had the ammunition it needed to act. The arrest came swiftly. In March 2018, Keith Raniere was tracked down and arrested by federal agents at a luxury villa in Mexico. His top lieutenants, including co-founder Nancy Salzman and the actress Allison Mack, who had become a high-level recruiter and master within DOS, were also arrested. And then, in July 2018, federal agents arrived to arrest Claire Bronfman. The image of the Seagram heiress being led away in handcuffs was a stunning, shocking moment. The Bronfman name was now officially linked not just to corporate failure, but to racketeering, sex trafficking, forced labor, and human branding. It was a new, unthinkable low for the dynasty. Initially, Claire remained defiant. She pleaded not guilty, and using what was left of her fortune, hired some of the best defense lawyers in the country. She and her supporters claimed she was the victim of a government conspiracy, a principled woman being persecuted for her unconventional beliefs. But as the trial date approached and the mountain of evidence against the NXIVM leadership grew, the United Front began to crack. One by one, her co-defendants, including Nancy Salzman and Allison Mack, pleaded guilty, admitting to their crimes. Finally, in April 2019, facing the prospect of a long and damning trial, Claire Bronfman capitulated. She stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts: conspiracy to conceal and harbor illegal aliens for financial gain and fraudulent use of identification. She admitted to orchestrating a scheme to help an NXIVM member stay in the U.S. illegally and to using the credit card of a deceased former partner of Ranieri's for his benefit. While these charges were less severe than the sex trafficking counts faced by Raniere, they were still serious federal crimes. Her sentencing took place in September 2020. Prosecutors had recommended a 5-year sentence, but the judge, Nicholas Garofis, was clearly appalled by what he had learned about Claire's role in the organization. He had read the victim impact statements, stories of lives ruined by the legal and psychological warfare that Claire had funded. He noted her complete and utter lack of remorse and the fact that she had submitted letters to the court still defending Keith Raniere. In a stunning rebuke, he sentenced her to 81 months in federal prison, 6 years and 9 months, a sentence significantly longer than what the prosecution had even asked for. He told her plainly that her actions had been appalling and that she had been a key enabler of Raniere's monstrous crimes. The sentence was a final, brutal reckoning. The journey that had begun with a search for meaning had ended in a federal prison cell. The Bronfman name, a name that once graced bottles of the world's finest spirits and a modernist masterpiece on Park Avenue, had reached its absolute nadir. It was now irrevocably tied to one of the most sordid and disturbing cult scandals of the 21st century. The story of the Bronfmans was no longer just about the rise and fall of a business. It had become a dark cautionary tale about the corruption of the human soul and the terrifying reality that even a fortune built to last for generations can be no defense against the darkness that lies within. So what is left of the Bronfman dynasty? The company is gone. The brands that Samuel Bronfman created, Crown Royal, Chivas Regal, are still global bestsellers, but they now enrich other corporations. The magnificent Seagram building on Park Avenue still stands, but as a monument to a fallen empire. The family name is permanently stained. Edgar Bronfman Jr. is remembered for one of the greatest corporate blunders in history. His sister, Claire Bronfman, traded her fortune and freedom to serve as the enabler for the monstrous NXIVM sex cult, ending her story in a federal prison cell. In the end, the Bronfman saga is a story of 2 legacies. The first belongs to Samuel, the penniless refugee who built a fortress of wealth to protect his family from the world. The second belongs to his heirs, who, having never known his struggle, did not understand that the greatest threat to the fortress was their own ambition and emptiness. They inherited an empire, but not the hunger that created it. From a desperate flight from Russia to the smoky speakeasies of Prohibition, from the heights of capitalism to the siren song of Hollywood, and finally, from a federal courtroom to a prison cell. The arc of the Bronfman dynasty is a brutal tragedy, a powerful reminder that no fortune is so vast and no name so powerful that it cannot be brought down, not by outside forces, but by the follies and failures from within.